This is our A Course in Miracles Letting Go series, taking one lesson at a time and letting go of anything that comes up for us other than the ideas presented in the lessons, so that we can allow the lessons to work upon us as they are intended. Things come up. We may not believe what's said in the lessons. We may resist or refuse them. That's okay. That will allow you to notice this energy that's been carried that's blocking what you are. And today's idea is simply that God's plan works. Only God's plan for salvation will work. And there could be all kinds of ideas of things that will work for your salvation other than God's plan. What's suggested in this lesson is that the ego is going to have you running around after all kinds of things. This will save me. That'll save me. There's something out there that'll save me. If only this were different, then I would be okay. Though all of those have this sense of uncertainty that you're okay right now, that God's plan is in effect, that salvation is already happening or has happened. So just taking this idea today, only God's plan for salvation will work. I'll just notice some of the voices that the ego brings up, that it's not working, some of this uncertainty. And then we'll start releasing the resistance to God's voice. What would God have you do? Who would God have you talk to? And what would God have you say and do, with whom and when? Could you start to allow up anything other than God's voice and release it? And be with the voice of God, releasing any resistance to hearing, to knowing exactly what God's plan is for you. And it's been suggested in the last few lessons, if you've been along with us, well, what are you? The light of the world. What is your function here? What is it? What are you here to do? Salvation. How do you do that? Forgive, forgive, forgive. What's stopping you from your function? Grievances, resentments, ideas of right and wrong, and all the things that need to change. Though the ego does not perceive your own best interests and will in fact have you running around in uncertainty as long as it holds domain, as long as you allow it to hold domain. So we'll just be releasing some of these ego survival programs to experience a program that works. God's program, God's plan, apart from the ego's plans. So let us begin. Taking this idea for the day, only God's plan for salvation will work. Only God's plan for salvation will work. Only God's plan for salvation will work. And could you notice any of the ego's plans and the uncertainty with them? If this happens, then I'll be okay. If that happens, then I'll be okay. Could you open up to and allow up any uncertainty in God's plan, as if you have to do it on your own as a separate ego? Just noticing some of these plans for your salvation that the ego has put up. If this is different, then I'll be okay. If that changes, I will be saved. What what have you been running after for salvation other than God's plan? So it seems. And could you notice any sense of uncertainty, any feeling behind some plan seemingly made apart from God? Could you notice how that feels? Letting any thoughts drift by, just notice some energy that would separate you from God's plan. Might feel like uncertainty, might feel like something's wrong. Whatever it feels like, it's just a feeling, it's not words. Could you open up to that feeling? Allow it up. And could you surrender this uncertainty, this feeling? Just turn it over. Would you surrender what the ego is seeking for salvation in exchange for the plan that works? God's plan for salvation. When could you surrender this energy and seeking things other than God's plan for you? You never have to, it's always optional. And just noticing if that feeling shifts or moves, and checking in with the idea only God's plan for salvation will work. Only God's plan for salvation will work. Only God's plan for salvation will work. Something certain, something powerful, something that's sure to work. Could you notice if there's been any uncertainty about things working out for you? Ideas that if things in the world were to change, then you'll be okay. Any grievances, any attacks on your okayness, your salvation. And going behind any thoughts that have arisen for you, could you simply welcome the feeling, the energy of uncertainty with the ego's plans for salvation, what it seeks? Could you allow up any of that energy, just letting the thoughts drift by without biting at them? And could you simply sit with this feeling for just a moment? And could you release this energy and the ego's uncertainty? Would you release this energy? When could you release this feeling and return to God's plan for salvation, which will work? And noticing anything shifting, any opening. Only God's plan for salvation will work. Only God's plan for salvation will work. And could you notice any resisting or refusing the certainty of God's plan for you? Any doubt that God's plan will work for you? That's all the ego's running around after this and that. Could you notice any resistance, refusal, denial of the certainty that God's plan for salvation will work? And that's okay. Without making right or wrong of what's coming up for you, could you allow it to come up? Could you feel what it feels like to be resisting the certainty of God's plan for salvation for you? Could you open up and allow up that feeling to run it out? Just let the resistance be there, maybe even resist more. It's been happening quite a lot. Resisting this perfect salvation, this perfect plan, the certainty that comes with it, with God's plan for your salvation that works. Could you open up and allow up any resisting, refusing that certainty, the absolute truth of the plan working for your salvation? And could you release this feeling? Let it go. Would you release the resistance if you could? When could you let go of resisting the certainty of God's plan for your salvation? A plan that works. Certain, guaranteed, absolute. There is a plan that works. It's not the ego's plan. Only God's plan for salvation will work. Only God's plan for salvation will work. Only God's plan for salvation will work. Can you imagine being in alignment with allowing God's plan for salvation to work? And could you notice any resisting or refusing a certain absolute truth, a plan for you? That plan carries with it no fear, no anger, no grievance, certainty. Could you notice any resisting, any refusing? Such absolute truth and certainty of your salvation, God's plan for your salvation that works. It's okay. Could you notice what it feels like letting any thoughts drift by? Just notice what it feels like to be resisting or refusing God's plan for salvation. The plan that works. Certainly. Absolutely. When could you allow yourself to just acknowledge, even welcome this energy, this cloud to your light, to God's light? And could you let it go? Would you let go of resisting the absolute truth, the certainty of God's plan for your salvation and the salvation of the world? When could you let go of the resistance and allow God's plan for salvation to work? Well, what is that plan? God's plan for salvation will work. Only God's plan for salvation will work. Only God's plan for salvation will work. And if you've allowed yourself to release some resistance, release some of the counter energy and feelings that have been carried over this course, perhaps you can hear, what would you have me do? What would God have me do? God, what would you have me do? What's your plan for my salvation and the salvation of the world? What would you have me do? And are you able to allow God's answer? Could you let any thoughts rushing through the mind to just go by? Any energy counter to God's voice being available to you now to come up and release? And could you humbly ask the question which guarantees an answer already there? God, what would you have me do? And just listening, opening to God's plan for your salvation. And God, where would you have me go? I was following the ego around wherever it told me to go. God, where would you have me go? God, where do I go from here in your plan for salvation that will work? Could you open up and allow your communion? Could you simply welcome God's word? God, where would you have me go in your plan that will work for salvation, mine and the world's? And maybe something comes through, maybe not. Could you be open that the question asked, it is answered? And could you allow God to direct you where to go? And only God's plan for salvation will work. God, what would you have me say? And to whom? Could you open up and allow yourself to humbly ask, what would you have me say? And to whom? God, could you avail yourself to the certainty, the absolute truth of what will lead to your salvation and the salvation of the world already done? God, what would you have me say? And to whom? And whether an answer seems clear now, it's done. Even if the answer does not seem clear now, it's certain. And could you allow for God's plan for salvation to work? Would you allow God's plan for salvation to work? When could you allow only God's plan for salvation to work? And as you go through the day today, as you remind yourself only God's plan for salvation will work. If you notice grievances arising, could you remind yourself only God's plan for salvation will work and release any of this energy of the grievances, the attacks, the defenses. Return to certainty of your salvation and the salvation of the world. Remind yourself often today, only God's plan for salvation will work. And that plan is made available to me if I only ask. What is thy will? What would you have me do? Where would you have me go? What would you have me say? And to whom? Could you humbly accept this incredible power and gift that is given you, the salvation of the world, and walk with certainty, an absolute plan that will work? And could you release any of the ego's scramblings, comings and goings, chasing after things it thinks will save the world, and allow yourself to return to the plan that works. Enjoy lighting the world today. Enjoy the answers that come to you that work. And I'll see you in the next session.